The alliance is at 75 years old. After the Cold War, I was a great and remain a great proponent of NATO enlargement. And I take great exception to using the Russian terminology you see in American media, NATO expansion.
I'm going to take some exception, John, with what you said in the opening. I don't see this advantage Russia.
We can just see the whole thing about the minerals deal going on right now with the with Ukraine, right? It's this very transactional thing, and
Hello and welcome back to The Focus. If you're not already alarmed by the sweeping changes emerging from the Trump White House, now might be a time to start paying attention. Ukraine has effectively been shut out of the very negotiations shaping its future. Russian military pressure keeps making minor advances against Ukrainian forces, and the Ukrainian Kursk salient has been collapsed by Russian and North Korean forces. Neither Russia nor Ukraine have lost their abilities to hit each other with drones and missile strikes. While it looks like a stalemate, to use a tennis term, it is, and perhaps always has been, advantage Russia. Joining us to unpack this unfolding crisis and its strategic implications are returning guests from the Atlantic Council, Washington, D.C., Professor Andrew Michta; from Frankfurt, Germany, former U.S. Army Commander Europe, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, retired; and from Copenhagen, Denmark, strategic commentator and Danish naval officer, Commander Anders Puck Nielsen. Gentlemen, welcome back to The Focus. Andrew,
Thank you.
Is Europe reliving 1938? Are we seeing a modern Chamberlain moment where the continent, through fear, fatigue, or strategic drift, is willing to sacrifice Ukraine in the name of peace? Or can we take some solace from the fact that the EU and the very heart of this project, Germany, have both committed themselves to rearmament?
So there's a German answer to this, Jein. So there's some yes and no. There are some aspects that are strikingly similar. If we can over-rationalize history and kind of make parallels to what happened in the past. Europe has been in a period of strategic slumber when it comes to the military issues. I actually find it very striking that, with the exception of the countries along the eastern flank, the largest countries like Germany, for example, have been relatively slow to respond, even though the war in Ukraine has been ongoing. The shock to the system that was delivered by the Trump administration, and I was at the Munich Security Conference, Ben was there as well, when VP Vance, Vice President Vance, gave his speech and the kind of reactions. There is, I think, a lot of confusion. There is a lot of good stuff in terms of committing money. The harsh reality is the defense industrial base in Europe has been contracting and has been neglected, and contracts have not been issued. The magazines are empty. So I like what I hear in terms of the rhetoric. It worries me that it is at times about building structures outside of NATO. If you look at the talk about European strategic autonomy that the French like to refer to, the kind of Gaullist moment, this should be done in NATO. But what worries me the most is that we're looking, I think, at about a decade that it would take for the Europeans to properly resource their military. So we're in a race against time.
There is something about that, though. I mean, yes, it takes time, but the Europeans seem to be moving with haste, which is quite kind of unnatural for them. I mean, when we spoke with previous guest Dr. Karl-Heinz Kamp, he was actually quite upbeat in terms of the way that he was seeing things. He said to me, quite frankly, he hasn't seen the Europeans move quite as quickly since the Trump administration has done and said all the things that they've done and said. So do we take some hope with us with regard to that observation, or do we still have to be cynical with regard to where Europe is positioning itself, because it is a split entity, right?
Yeah, I am trying to be optimistic, but I'm very concerned because this is really about the politics of the transatlantic relationship. In the final analysis, the dollar cents, euros, euro cents that go into the box, they need to be anchored in the larger, as the Germans say, Gestalt of what the relationship is supposed to be. I have this sinking feeling that we're looking at a fundamental geopolitical realignment. I remember incoming Chancellor Merz shortly after the Munich Security Conference speech by J.D. Vance going, we have to be independent. The French talking about using their nuclear deterrent to kind of provide that capability. I think I'm a committed transatlanticist. I think if we see the fracturing of the transatlantic link, everybody loses. Alliances are force multipliers. But alliances have to rest on the fundamental principles of shared threats and shared interests. And I would like to unpack one thing, John, that you said. You used the term Europeans. I think that has become a bit of a moniker that allows people to gloss over the real differences that you have within Europe. I called it the regionalized security optics. If I go to Helsinki or Tallinn or Stockholm or Warsaw or Bucharest, it's all about Russia. The threat is existential, keenly felt. It's different when I'm in Berlin. Germany is no longer a frontier state like the Bonn Republic was. It's got buffers in the east. It has tried to use economic and political means to manage its relationship with Russia. That policy failed, unfortunately, disastrous in many respects in terms of energy dependence on Russia that created. If you go to Paris, you have a different conversation. Again, the French look to the south. They will tell you Europe's southern border is not on the Med, it's deep in Africa and the Sahel. And I joke when I get to Portugal, I have no idea what they're talking about other than migration. So my point is this fractured regionalized security optics makes me always very cautious to speak, the Europeans are doing X, Y, Z. I'd rather know what are the Finns doing, what are the Poles doing. And what's missing is this overarching sense that this is happening within NATO with America's leadership, because we're primus inter pares in the final analysis.
So if I could just hand over to Ben and Anders for their observations, what is Europe exactly as a security entity? Is it a confederation? Should it be a confederation? Can it be something tighter? What is something that you think is missing in terms of how the Europeans can bring things together? I mean, Andrew's just made the point that, Europe has got a fractured security identity. To the east, countries are worried about Russia. To the south, they're worried about immigration coming up from the Middle East and Africa. So can Brussels create a unified defense construct to solve the problem? Because it's a twin problem, it's an existential problem, but can Europe have I don't know, what is the word I'm looking for, the imagination necessary to actually bring it all together into something coherent? Ben, start with you.
Okay. First of all, I'm going to take some exception, John, with what you said in the opening. I don't see this advantage Russia. I mean, General Cavoli just 2 weeks ago in his testimony to the House and Senate Armed Services Committee said Ukraine is winning. So in fact, the only place where it's advantage Russia is in the Oval Office, in the Trump administration. Otherwise, the Ukrainians can see that Russia cannot knock them out of this war. It's not going to happen. And so they're not under pressure to have to accept a bad settlement. And because the Trump administration is largely negotiating directly with the Kremlin, with their very incompetent Mr. Witkoff as the lead negotiator, Ukraine nor any European country are obligated to accept or live with these outcomes. And now you see reports today that the administration is putting pressure on European countries to stop supporting Ukraine. So this is going to be the test, and maybe this will help answer your question. Will Europeans realize or accept that their combined economies and militaries and defense industry potential dwarfs Russia? It dwarfs it. I mean, it's not even close. If, assuming, and I know this is a gigantic if they can generally come together. But I keep seeing places where they are, in fact, coming together. The fact that Germany passed a law that now allows them to go into debt like the rest of us to increase defense spending and also to improve infrastructure. This is huge. Germans, of course, I do live here in Frankfurt, and my neighbors, they don't like the word, leader. They don't want to be seen as, hey, we're now the leader of Europe for a number of reasons. But in my view, the best leaders were always the ones who led by example. That doesn't require the Bundeskanzler to get up there and wave the flag and all that sort of thing. Now, think of your favorite football team. The best player and the leader on the team is probably not the loudest player. It's the one that delivers. And this is a role I think that Germany can fill. I hope they will. You've got a German enhanced forward presence battalion that's growing into a brigade. Of course, it's taken too long. Andrew's right about that. It's just taken too long. But the fact is, this is going to be like the most powerful brigade in all of Europe once it's set and in place and it's integrated into Lithuania's defense and as part of NATO's regional defense plan. Now, the fact is, Europe is going to have to do this out of necessity because even if this was not a Trump administration, forget all that. Since the Obama administration, the U.S. has been trying to shift its priority to the Indo-Pacific region. And it is indefensible that these very wealthy European nations have taken a holiday from legitimate defense investment and spending to be able to defend themselves with a very small American presence. Actually, there's only about 80,000 Americans in uniform in all of Europe now, including those who are assigned and those who are rotational. At 80,000, that would not fill up the University of Michigan football stadium. It would not fill Wembley Stadium. It would barely fill, a large German football stadium. So I think the only thing that's lacking here is self-confidence. Europeans lacking self-confidence, and I have a sense that they're going to find it. They see that if Ukraine fails, that you will have millions more Ukrainian refugees pouring into Poland and Germany and other parts of Europe, that the continued disruption of food and energy supplies is going to have a terrible knock-on effect on European economies. And so I think eventually they're going to get there. One other example where I see this is working, and this is in the Baltic Sea, and President Stubb of Finland is providing the kind of leadership, at least in that region, that is needed. Back in January, he hosted a meeting of all the heads of government of all the Baltic states, not just Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, but also Poland, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. And Secretary General Rutte showed up at this thing, and I think Dr. von der Leyen was also there. And so here's a regional leader saying we got to do something about these goddamn Russian ships that are destroying infrastructure or sailing ships in violation of sanctions that help Russia get money from oil and gas sales. That was an important step to start thinking what are concrete things we can do that are below Article 5 to start pushing back on this. And there you see Estonia just the other day seized one of these vessels. These are the kind of things that give me some optimism.
Anders.
I think I'm going to address something that Andrew said, which is that NATO has to be the framework also going forward, and that it's important that Europe doesn't build alternative structures. And I think the big discussion right now is really what are the long-term perspectives for the United States here. And I don't think anybody knows really what is it Donald Trump wants to do and how far is this going. But the big question really is this the storm that we have to weather, or is this the beginning of something that is much more profound? But definitely from this side of the Atlantic, what it looks like is that the United States is basically working with the Russians to ensure a Russian victory in Ukraine. And that is an unacceptable outcome. So we right now find ourselves on opposite sides in the question of this massive land war that is going on our continent. And with the United States withdrawing from European security, it is just more important that Ukraine actually gets out of this war on favorable terms. It is not an acceptable outcome for the European countries that Ukraine would lose this war and that Putin gets his will. So I think that's really the big concern right now. How much in this question is NATO the framework going forward? Well, that's what the Europeans would like to see mostly. Most European countries definitely want to continue the relationship with the United States. But if this is the line going forward from the administration in the White House, then really we can't build a European security structure on that framework where there are Americans all over the place, because if the American administration is basically working with the enemy. So that's that's the dilemma right now. And I think what the European countries are looking at is we have to do this simultaneously. We have to try to work within the existing frameworks, but we have to have something that is outside of NATO as well, because of all that uncertainty.
When you talk about the idea of having a structure outside of NATO, the thought occurs to me that perhaps we're in a very difficult situation because America's position post-World War II on the European continent was one of Pax Americana, and NATO was meant to be the junior partner of the United States in terms of military security. It was never designed to pick up the slack. It was never expected for it to become a dominant partner or an equal partner of the United States within the continent. Because that, forgive me if I say this wrong, but I think the notion was to keep Germany down and the Russians out, and it'd be the United States that would be the prime mover on that. Perhaps we can pass it back to Andrew and Ben to have a little chat about that. Yeah.
Look, if you look at the Cold War era alliance, and in 1955 we brought Germany into NATO just a decade after the war ended, and we did this not because of any particular sympathy for the Germans. It was a geopolitical imperative. If we were not to just simply rely on nukes, but have some options that the president and the leaders in Europe would have, you needed to reintegrate Germany. Germany was the principal theater. The size of the Bundeswehr, what the Germans were risking, remember, in the event of the war, this would have probably been an incinerated part of European territory if everything happened, in this kind of most extreme scenario. And yet, what was in existence then was the clarity on threat perceptions. It didn't matter if you were in Paris or in Bonn or in London. If the balloon went up, you were in it. This takes me back to this fractured regionalized security optics. The alliance is at 75 years old. After the Cold War, I was a great and remain a great proponent of NATO enlargement. And I take great exception to using the Russian terminology you see in American media, NATO expansion. Words matter. Expansion has a negative, aggressive connotation that somehow you're trying to dominate your adversary. Enlargement was a democratic process. Those nations wanted to anchor themselves in the West. And the second point is you almost had a two-step, even though it was not interconnected. You had NATO enlargement that provided the security umbrella, a relatively simple process because actually we did not do much with it other than the political arena. And then the EU enlargement followed that integrated their markets and the rest of it. We're now in a situation where I believe NATO will either restore itself as a collective defense organization. It has regional plans. Those plans have to be resourced with conventional capabilities. And Ben is much better positioned to speak to this, but I will simply say, all the talk in NATO about burden sharing should be replaced with burden transferring. What Ben said, a wealthy continent, about 500 million people, Russian GDP is a joke in comparison, cannot feel the forces that we need with US nuclear umbrella, high-end enablers are, other assets that we bring in. I mean, when the war in Ukraine started, without American logistics, we couldn't have supplied the Ukrainians. And yet, throughout the post-Cold War period, this kind of strategic slumber and this disarmament. I mean, in Germany, really beginning with, I think, so Gutenberg and maybe de Maizière as well, the defense budget became a piggy bank for all sorts of other government spending. So the Europeans are delinquent. And I hope Anders won't shoot me for this, but when I say you're a delinquent, you're a delinquent. What Trump has been saying to you is true. Every president has been saying to you, you got to spend the money. Not in the way we're talking about it right now, because NATO is not a protection racket. You either pay or you don't pay. But the truth is, in an alliance, if in a treaty-based organization, where at Vilnius, every prime minister, every president, every leader of every European country signed on to these regional plans, those plans have capabilities tied to them. If you're not delivering, you're not delivering on the NATO treaty. So this is the first thing. The second thing that worries me the most, I'm currently writing a book on various scenarios where I think Europe can go, and I'm trying to make some recommendations on U.S. strategy towards Europe for the next decade or so. And in my view is that the European Union in the final analysis is a tremendous success when it comes to market integration, does good work in regulatory space, sometimes overshoots and comes up with idiotic things, but show me a bureaucracy that doesn't. I'm not cutting them any slack. I'm just saying this is the reality. Europe is not a defense alliance. The European Union is not a defense alliance. And the fact that you appoint a commissioner for foreign policy or a commissioner for doesn't change that. The fundamentals, without the United States, who provides the nuclear umbrella to Europe to deter Russia? You look at what the French have and look what the Russians have. You look at and most of all, deterrence rests on two things, on capabilities and will. So you have to be credible. I can accept that maybe the French deterrent would work when it comes to protecting Germany. But if you're a Lithuanian or an Estonian, would you buy into that? If you start building a European defense structure that does not have that American punching power, how do you convince the Estonians that the Portuguese are going to show up and put their lives on the line to defend them on the flank? There's something fundamental, John, happening in European geopolitics right now. And I think the people who are in power in Washington, the administration, number one, doesn't understand Russia, the nature of the Russian imperial state. They think they can make a transactional arrangement. Anders is right to an extent, I would argue. They're trying for a reset of sorts in relations. They're trying to build a working relationship, maybe even a cooperative relationship, which in effect then poses a fundamental question. What happens to NATO? Every document NATO has right now identifies Russia as an adversary. If the United States says, well, Russia is no longer an adversary, we're not in Kansas anymore, right? I mean, things are changing. I think the fundamental problem that we have, and what worries me the most, is that it's not even Russia that's going to define Europe's future. It's how Europe rolls on China that will be defining for Europe's future. I wrote about it for Politico about 4 years ago. And I hear a lot of noises right now coming out. The idea that you would not only make yourself dependent economically on China, but in some shape or form bring the Chinese as a security actor to Europe, as a broker in the peace in Ukraine, for example, or in some defense-related capacity, then 700 years of European history are gone. Sayonara. That you're talking about such fundamental changes. And I cannot imagine that you can then restitch the transatlantic alliance with key European countries going in the direction of China, the United States possibly going for a kinetic conflict with the Chinese. I've always told the Europeans, if America goes to war in the Indo-Pacific, you cannot sit it out. I don't mean that you have capabilities to necessarily send in, but you cannot pretend that that's not your problem, because I cannot imagine the U.S. Congress, saying, oh yeah, that's fine, let's do it. So we're looking at some of the most fundamental shifts, and the war in Ukraine, because it was another case of deterrence failing in Europe. And we had 3 cases of deterrence failing, John. We had second invasion of Ukraine in 2022. We had the Hamas attacks at the closest ally of the United States, and then Iran launching an attack at the Israelis, even though Washington was saying, to Tehran, I say don't. So there's a fundamental question of what those 3 decades of appeasement have wrought in terms of what we can do now to restore deterrence. And I don't know of very many cases, and I'll stop here, I apologize, I'm taking so much time. I don't know of very many cases in history where deterrence can be restored without war. And if somebody can show me how we can do it through policy, ich bin ganz ohr, as the Germans say.
Just before we pass on to Ben and Anders, one of the things that I think is so critical about this period of time is the lack of trust. And here I'm not talking about deep state trust. I'm not talking about trust between military forces that have been operating for years on the continent together. I'm talking about political trust. There's no political trust anymore. That shibboleth has been broken. Now that that's been broken, how can the rest of the system restore itself? When Donald Trump, came in, he came on a promise of shaking things up, of being radical. And yes, he has been extremely radical. But you know what? Business can't operate in a radicalized environment. Governments can't operate in a radicalized environment. And when the global hegemon turns around to its nearest and dearest allies and tells them all to bugger off and, look after yourself and, oh, by the way, I'm going to slap, God knows how many % of tariffs on you just for whatever the thing happens to be. Aren't we looking at something so fundamental in terms of, well, the Europeans won't be able to come back from, to trust the Americans? Ben, what do you think?
Well, for sure, we're not going to get back, even if there's a complete change in the White House in 3 years and you've got Democratic administration, whatever, we're not going to get back to what it was because so many Europeans will have realized that, Trump was elected by 77 million voters and enabled by many members of the Congress who were thought to be strong pro-Ukraine, pro-transatlanticist, pro-NATO, and yet they went along with this. So I think there is a sense of loss and a betrayal, even if you brought in somebody that tried to repair all that. It'll be difficult to repair that. I'm still a little bit confused by Andrew, though, when he was talking about China and then said sayonara. And I'm sure Japanese, not Chinese, but
they are talking with each other now, Ben. They are talking to each other.
There's so many examples of incredibly stupid mistakes by this administration that are going to ruin American. I mean, somebody used the phrase killing the goose that laid the golden egg, doing things that will drive away allies and customers from buying American defense products. I was in beautiful Copenhagen a couple of weeks ago at an event hosted by the American Chamber of Commerce there. And there were 3 members of the Danish parliament that participated in a roundtable event afterwards. And they were very, very unhappy with the United States. This was just a couple of days before the vice president's visit to Greenland. And, of course, Denmark is on the cusp of buying the F-35. And they all said, not so sure we can trust or be confident that the United States won't have a policy change that then we're screwed after gazillions of dollars being spent and or we get the F-35 minus, not the real, protein-rich F-35. So it's these kinds of policies that are going to wreck us. The fact that the administration continues to side completely, and I think, Anders, you said this at the beginning, 100% with Russia. Never in my life did I imagine that this would be the case. And I can't understand exactly why it is like it is. But I am not convinced that NATO can't survive or go on without the United States. Obviously, it would be a fundamentally different type of alliance, but I would not see the need for creating something new just because the U.S. pulled out. Now, Andrew, of course, is correct 100% that, the nuclear deterrent, that will be significantly different. But I'm not convinced that even this administration would withdraw that because we have so many strategic interests in Europe. No matter how unhappy the president may be with our European allies, the fact is the access that we get with bases in UK and Spain and Italy and Greece and Turkey and Germany, the ability, if we really care about the Arctic, you don't address the Arctic by pulling out of NATO. You address the Arctic by working with all of our allies that touch the Arctic or touch the North Atlantic. And so I'm not convinced that President Trump is just going to say, okay, F you guys, take his ball and go home, because we would be doing so much damage to our own interests. So I'm reluctant to predict because the president does not act on moral principle. It's 100% transactional. So that doesn't mean he can't just do a hard left turn or a hard right turn.
Anders.
I agree. I mean, that's the essential problem is really that the trust is not there, that the United States will definitely, be there when Europe needs it. And we can just see the whole thing about the minerals deal going on right now with the with Ukraine, right? It's this very transactional thing, and I think everyone here is expecting Donald Trump should do the same if we need help. So the big question will be, well, what do you have to give us? And if we give you something that's worth $1 billion, you give us something, right? I think he would obviously ask for Greenland. I think he might find other things he would want as well. So it's really difficult to base a relationship on the assumption that the United States will not really be there. And unfortunately, I think when we are having these discussions, that's also the concern. When we are having these discussions, then obviously this is also something they're thinking about in Russia. So just the fact that there is this uncertainty now in itself is terrible for European security, because it increases the risk of war. It increases the risk that they might think that, well, maybe we could get away with something. So no matter how you look at this and say, well, definitely the Europeans should have done more at a different time and all those things, then what's happening right now is a very quick deterioration of European security.
Just on the whole trust issue, I'd like to get Andrew and Ben to address one thing which I think is always under the surface but never really spoken openly about, and that is, how far has MAGA corrupted the US military as an institution? Because I understand that the military is a non-partisan body, or at least in its finest tradition, it should not be partisan. But I think that we're starting to see movement on that. We're starting to see that, there is a sort of divided loyalty. Yes, the Constitution is fine, but now we've got this guy Trump, and he demands loyalty from all those who serve under him. I think it's only a matter of time before he puts the hard word on the US military. And how would that actually affect things? Perhaps if we go to Ben and then Andrew and then go back to Anders on that one, yeah?
So I am very worried that our military is under enormous pressure to do and say things that are wrong or illegal. When the president basically beheaded the senior leadership by sacking the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Brown, the chief of naval operations, Admiral Franchetti, the commandant of the Coast Guard, the head of NSA, and then down below that, getting rid of all the judge advocates general from each of the services. I mean, these are the kind of things you do if you want to create a military. I mean, what did Trump say on the campaign trail? I want generals like Hitler had. Okay. And I don't think he was talking about, daring tactical guys like Rommel and Manstein. He was talking about people that would say, yes, sir, and do whatever they were told, follow orders. I have carried this with me for the last 20 years. It's my copy of the Constitution. And you can see it's pretty dog-eared. And in Article 1, Section Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, it lays out all the authorities and duties and responsibilities of the Congress. And then you go to Article 2 of the Constitution, Section 2, that's where it says that the president shall be commander in chief. That's not an administrative thing. I mean, Article 1, the Congress, Article 2, the executive. And, we have taken this oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States for certainly all my life, and going way back to post-Civil War when the oath was instituted, this particular oath. And we do it every time there's a promotion ceremony, a commissioning ceremony, a reenlistment ceremony, over and over and over and over and over, to remind women and men of the armed forces that your oath is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And you will not be able to use what we refer to as the Nuremberg defense. Well, when you do something illegal and say, well, I was just following orders. While President Trump may have immunity, according to the Supreme Court, none of these other people will have immunity. And so I would like to hope and believe that the brand new chairman, who was just confirmed the other day, General Kane, and the other senior leaders, when they're told by the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Hegseth, who is only the Secretary of Defense because he will never in his life say no to the president, he can do a lot of push-ups, but that's hardly the main qualification to be Secretary of Defense. I hope that these officers will be able to say, Mr. Secretary, you're telling us to draw up plans for the seizure of Greenland? This is a territory of a NATO ally, or to do something against Canada. These are NATO allies. That's a violation of a treaty. That is an unlawful order. And so, when General Milley was the chairman, and we had this terrible situation where you had Black Lives Matter protesters in front of the White House, and literally they wanted the military to go out and shoot protesters. And of course, General Milley had the courage to say, no, we're not going to do that. Soldiers don't shoot American citizens just because they're protesters. We can't do that. And then somebody said, well, can't you just shoot them in the legs? I mean, this is the mentality that's there. And so our officer corps is really going to be, already is being tested. I hope that they will meet the test and that the Congress will perform its oversight duty and protect them, because these women and men will not be immune to prosecution.
Sure. Andrew, from the Washington Beltway environment, what do you see in all of this? Do you also see that MAGA has got its tentacles well and truly within the system and is already starting to develop a different way, if you will?
Well, two things, John. The image of tentacles and all of that you're putting out there. The movement is a dominant part of the Republican Party right now. It's driven the process. But the GOP is also a combination of other factions that are broken up or that are trying to coalesce. So even in the administration, in my assessment, you're looking at a number of factions. It's not the kind of uniform train that's moving. Ben is right, in my view, that the loyalty to the president in this administration, when he makes the appointment, is the supreme criterion. And I think in large part because of the experience of Donald Trump's first presidency, where I was in Germany already at that time. And my sense was that most of the Europeans were not really understanding the nature of the American system, because most of the European governments are products of their parliaments, with very few exceptions. The executive power of the presidency, I sometimes joke, we elect the king, in effect. And that king is checked by Congress and by our laws and by the rest of it. I don't have a fraction of Ben's knowledge about the military, but I spent about 20 years as a civilian working with the US military and had, officers work for me in my various capacities. And what Ben says about taking the oath to the Constitution, that's key. I always tell my European friends when I'm over there, never to underestimate the strength of the American consolidated political institutions. I mean, we are a very young republic, I think about 249 years old at this point. We're in the midst of a very, very important structural churning, and we could talk about why this happened. Donald Trump is a manifestation of things that have been happening in the American political culture for quite some time, and I've always tried to argue this line. The disconnect with Europe is largely ideological. It's not just, it's how most of the European elites see the world operate, how they structure their approach to governance, and what is happening now in the United States. We may speak the same language in terms of using English, but this is a very different culture in many ways. And it's in the process of the kind of internal spasm right now. But in all of this, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the 70s with hyperinflation and post-Vietnam syndrome. It will boil down to leadership. We are in the first few months of this administration right now. And I'm not making excuses. I'm simply saying what we're likely to see, because I don't care for the kind of way of interacting with allies, how we speak about policy. I think it's unnecessarily damaging in terms of just creating tensions and getting personalities involved. But let's ask ourselves what happens if Putin continues to play this game, for example, in Ukraine. And all of a sudden, the president who was supposed to deliver this within 24 hours cannot deliver it. Right now, the narrative, it's Biden's war. Well, within a year, it will become Trump's war because he is now the president. He is now has to make decisions. I think there's a lot that's happening inside the Democrat Party and inside the GOP. To a large extent, I think what we're also looking at, I just drove recently through Southern California and Arizona and beyond, small towns talking to people. And it was both encouraging and heartbreaking because the infrastructure in the country is crumbling. The heartland has been abandoned. Deindustrialization means that people cannot get the kind of employment that would generate the incomes that could sustain a decent, middle-class existence. But at the same time, and I'm not being a Boy Scout, but really the goodness and the openness of the American people. This is still a very unique nation that has been very poorly served, in my view, by the elites over the last 30, 40 years. I mean, if you look at the changes in the political parties, the fact that the GOP is now largely a blue-collar, working class, when you look at the MAGA element, political party, that used to be the constituency of the Democratic Party. Yeah. The Democratic Party now is essentially, it's still trying to articulate the issues that are relevant to minorities, but it's also a party of very wealthy people who are liberal or beyond that to the left. The traditional GOP has fractured. If you look at the elections in Ohio, for example, during the primaries when J.D. Vance was competing, I think he got 30-some% of the vote. The other two principal candidates got 40-some, but they split the vote. So J.D. got the nomination and became the senator. So my point is, just as an example, this is a story the Europeans don't see. The Europeans should look beyond just the personality of Donald Trump. Final comment, if I may. I'm looking at Anders here. Again, don't kill me. I always tell my friends in Europe, you don't have a relationship with this or that politician in America, this or that political party. You have a vital national security relationship and an alliance with the United States of America. So in a nutshell, work the problem, people. Find a way to work with the United States in a way that preserves the equities. And that doesn't mean bending the knee, and it's articulating very specifically what the interests are. So you look at Greenland. My sense is that the administration is very keen on consolidating kind of a bounded order within the Western Hemisphere, and it's therefore all this pressure on Greenland and the Danes. I also think the northeastern corridor around the Baltic and Scandinavia will be very important to the administration. Well, come up with some specific proposals. I know it's a very tough period, but look forward and think about what the administration may look like in a year. How many of the principles are likely to be there? Which of the policies are actually going to work? So we may be looking at a very different geostrategic environment within a year, and it may be, digging in and more of the same and pushing, or it may be an attempt to actually think in structural and national interest terms. So it's very early right now.
Okay, so if we go on and continue with Anders on this, does the EU have the diplomatic sophistication to work the problem? Or are they falling into that age-old political trap where everything becomes deeply personal very fast and we can't separate policy from personality? Does Europe have the capacities necessary to pull those two things apart, look at the United States much more objectively, forget about the orange one, and just see where the US is actually going?
Well, I don't know that anybody knows where the U.S. is going right now. I mean, there is definitely there is one interpretation that says that Donald Trump is an anomaly here, and that the United States has, security interests that are more important than this person, and that eventually, there will be this relationship, a kind of return to normalization. That is definitely one interpretation here, and in that case, I very much agree with what Andrew says. But there's also another interpretation that says that what's happening in the United States is an attempt at a dictatorial power takeover. Right, basically, that this is the playbook all over again, and Europe unfortunately has rich experience with these kinds of things. And looking from where I am, it's very hard to see the difference between those two things, right? But I think we would definitely need to see very quickly some of that institutional power in Washington start showing some resistance to what Donald Trump is doing. There's a constitutional crisis right now about these prisons in El Salvador, right? And there has to be some kind of resistance here, because if this continues the way it's going, then we are looking into something that would be permanent damage to the United States. And Donald Trump himself is talking about a third term. How is he going to do that, right? But we've seen other people in that kind of situation being able to do that. So I think what we have in Europe is this confusion about which of these two scenarios is playing out right now. Is this just Donald Trump being kind of incompetent and a buffoon, or is this actually an attempt at something more nefarious? And it's really difficult to know, okay, how we're going to navigate in that.
Yeah. Look, if I can return us to a more tactical and arguably a more immediate thing, and that is the things that are going on within Ukraine right now. We'll start off with Anders, go to Ben, and then go to Andrew for everyone's observations. So, Anders, how has Ukraine's loss of its position in Kursk in Western Russia affected the overall operational situation of the armed forces of Ukraine?
I don't think it has changed all that much. I mean, the Ukraine's presence, or the incursion they made into Kursk, was basically about stretching out the Russian forces, forcing them to protect a much longer front line, and to give them some problems in terms of not being able to say, well, let's freeze the front line thing, because that would also mean Ukraine having a part of Russia. They are still in Kursk. It's just a little corner of it, but basically it still functions as this thing that forces the Russians to stretch out, spread their forces on a longer front line. And I still think that's working quite well.
Ben, what do you think?
I thought this was a brilliant stroke by the Ukrainians. When you look at what was happening in the eastern part of Ukraine, and people were walking around, oh my God, Avdiivka has fallen, the Russians are marching on Pokrovsk. They made it sound like this was the Red Army in 1944. Yeah. When in fact, if you look at where Avdiivka is on the map, it's about as far in the east as you could possibly be and still be in Ukraine. and it took the Russians years to get that. And then to go from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk, it's about 60 kilometers. I mean, we're talking about 35 miles for your non-metric audience out there. And in a year, they haven't been able to do that. So I think that the Ukrainian General Staff saw that this was a place where they could accept some risk to do what we would call doctrinally economy of force mission. You know, it sucks to be a company commander, by the way, if you're out in Pokrovsk, but from a operational level, to say, all right, you guys, we can see that there's no way the Russians can break through and do anything. I mean, they're going to keep pounding, but they can't overrun you. And so now is the time to do something at the operational level of war that would completely change the narrative of Russia can't be stopped or can't be beaten. It would, I agree with everything that Anders said, so I won't repeat it, but there were so many positive effects that would be achieved. And of course, the Ukrainians know more about Russia than we will know in a million years. And they knew that the FSB and the General Staff hate each other, and the FSB is responsible for the border, and that the General Staff would not go out of their way to help the FSB. And so it was a brilliant stroke on so many different facets and levels. So I hope they do it again. I imagine that they are looking for other places where they could launch a similar strike over in some part. You know, every commander wants the initiative. You want the enemy reacting to you, not constantly reacting to the enemy. So I think this was a good move by the Ukrainian General Staff.
Do you think that Ukraine has enough left in its tank to push forward again? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the fact that, yes, there's the obvious size difference between Russia and Ukraine, that both of them are bleeding manpower, but it's going to be more tragic for the Ukrainian side because they're fighting like lions, but they're losing men in a way that they cannot replace. So do you see that, you know, perhaps there is something to that? I don't know.
I don't accept that characterization at all. Ukraine has about 900,000 troops. They have finally started to solve their problems of, you know, they didn't have what we would recognize as the institutional army or institutional navy, the part of the military that generates the operational force. So now they finally are getting that. They have a population of 36 million, several million of which, of course, are not in Ukraine. They're sitting here in Germany, Romania, Poland. Yeah. So the government has the burden to regain the confidence of families to say, come on, we need you, but we're not going to send your son or daughter into combat until they are properly trained, properly equipped, and in a well-trained, proper unit. So they still have a lot of work to do, but this is no longer a situation where Ukraine is going to run out of people before the Russians. The Russians are the ones that are out there dragging North Koreans into the fight, kidnapping Chinese, basically, who thought they were going to be working for some construction company, and they find themselves as privates, you know, in the Russian army. So I think Russia actually is in trouble economically as well as manpower than are the Ukrainians. Look, and I will stick around to hear what Andrew has to say, but after this, I'm up against a hard stop. The last big empire that fought to hang on to its crown jewel was France, that fought to hang on to Algeria. The French killed 1 million Algerians, and that was not enough to cause the Algerians to buckle. And there's no way in hell that Ukraine is going to buckle.
Great, thank you for that. Andrew, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think I agree that we're in a situation where with this level of support, we're basically kind of in a stasis of sorts. I was very proud when President Biden, you know, decided to move and support Ukraine. I was extremely disappointed how then the policy proceeded with the kind of obsession about escalation management. I would submit to you, and again, I can't prove it, but of course, but I believe that in 2022, during that offensive, had we given the Ukrainians what they needed, they could have broken the Russians on the battlefield. Russians had no logistics, no defenses, no leadership. Smaller states can defeat larger powers. We've got ample examples in history of that, number one. Number two, just like right now, if we continue on this trajectory, and I thought, with all due respect to President Biden, the as long as it takes kind of strategy, you don't fight wars this way. You give them what they need to break the enemy and achieve your objectives. I think there will not be a negotiated settlement worth anything, whether it's ceasefire or we call it, peace treaty or Muscovy duck, unless the Russians believe that the cost of continuing exceeds the actual strategic objectives they set for themselves. And for that, they really have to feel real pain. And so it's not going to be done by Mr. Witkoff, running back and forth from Moscow. It's not going to be done by statements. It's going to be done when Putin realizes that he has to mobilize young men from large urban areas, Moscow, Petersburg, and the babushkas come in the streets, and the so-called Russian middle class feels the pain, not just Buryatia, and all the rest of it. And we're not there in terms of strategic thinking. I am with Ben on one thing. I spent 7 years working with the Ukrainian military when I was in Garmisch. And I was a frequent visitor. What this invasion did, it consolidated the Ukrainian national identity. When I would travel to Volhynia or Halachina, it was very Central European, very nationalistic, very patriotic. Central Ukraine was kind of a mishmash of things. Eastern was post-Soviet Russian speaking. That humiliation of Crimea, this invasion, this murder of Ukrainians, it ensures that any dream that Putin can have Ukraine, right, is a pipe dream. And even if he defeats Ukraine, and I think he's determined either to destroy Ukraine or to have Ukraine, there's no, anything in between for him. Even if he defeats the military and incorporates a large chunk of the Ukrainians into his security services, this will not stop the sense of, I am Ukrainian because I am in opposition to this Russian BS about, the Malorusini who are out there. They're part of the great Slavic community. So something very fundamental has changed. You will not have any sort of settlement until the Russians really feel that they cannot achieve their objectives at an acceptable price.
Okay, now I know that Ben has to leave us. So, Ben, we look forward to speaking to you again sometime in the near future, hopefully with these other two fine gentlemen on either side of you.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity and the privilege of being on this podcast and with two old friends as well. So best wishes to all of you.
I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. And from the United States, we're speaking with Andrew Michta. From Germany, we have just spoken to Ben Hodges. And from Denmark, we're speaking with Anders Puck Nielsen. So, gentlemen, when I was speaking with former German Defense Ministry official Karl-Heinz Kamp, we were talking about nuclear deterrent and Europe's nuclear deterrence. Obviously, when Europe wants to become more of a power internationally, one automatically thinks, well, what is the most powerful thing they bring to the table? Well, there is the French and the British nuclear deterrence. But there are limits to how those deterrents can operate. I mean, the British have arguably not got an independent nuclear deterrent. Much of their nuclear deterrent is based on submarines, and much of those submarines are actually looked after by the United States to a great degree, including the missiles in which their British nuclear warheads are mounted. So I think that for London, they really can't put too much on the table, although France does have a far better, more robust system. They still have, well, they don't have a triad anymore. They've got a dyad. They've got air-based and submarine-based nuclear weapons. But again, the numbers are very small. So if we were going to imagine, for instance, that, I don't know, maybe Emmanuel Macron will get his European forces together and, station them along a demarcation line, a demilitarized zone, if you will, in Ukraine, if the war should ever come to an end, it would be only under Macron that France would be able to bring nuclear weapons to the table, because if you look at the political implications of what's going on in France right now, the right-wing pro-Russian types are looking pretty fierce, and Britain really can't bring much to the table. So where does that leave Europe's nuclear deterrence? Anders, we'll start with you.
I think the whole non-proliferation scheme is really under pressure these years. It's basically the whole system we have is built around the assumption that the United States will provide the nuclear umbrella for what we can call the democratic alliance around the world. So it's not just Europe, but it's also in Asia. And now that there is concern about how reliable an ally the United States will be going forward, then that also raises concern about the nuclear deterrence. And we are seeing emerging discussions about this, like does Europe need something else? And clearly what there is right now in France and the United Kingdom, it's not sufficient. And also, I'm not sure most European countries would be willing to just exchange sort of reliance on America with reliance on France, because are we really sure that Paris will be there for the Eastern European countries when it comes to it? So, and then there is, of course, the whole discussion about a nuclear umbrella for Ukraine. And I've made the argument for a long time now that if somehow Ukraine is going to be covered by a nuclear umbrella, and if the United States, if NATO is not willing to do it, Ukraine is going to do it. So we will need to find some way to deal with that, and I hope that we will be able to do it in a way where we will still stay within the boundaries of the existing non-proliferation scheme. So we won't end up in a proliferation nightmare, which might happen if new countries start building these. But unfortunately, there is so much pressure on the whole system because there is this uncertainty. It's not an acceptable situation that the autocracies in the world, they have nuclear weapons and the democracies don't. That's not a sustainable outcome, at least.
Andrew, I kind of think that if I was Zelensky, I would have already started a covert nuclear weapons program in Ukraine. I know that sounds an awful thing to contemplate, and Anders is right. I mean, any such move like that would break international non-proliferation expectations. But, we do live in a different world now, and as the pressure mounts, I think that in the long term, the Ukrainians will want to have that nuclear guarantee. And if it doesn't come from the Americans, and if it doesn't come from Western European allies, it will have to come from its own resources. What are your thoughts on this and the implications of a Ukrainian nuclear breakout?
Well, when I talk to Ukrainians, I mean, you very often hear that the dumbest thing they've done was to trust the West on turning over their deterrent.
Yeah.
Whether or not they can do it independently and that have not leaking into the intel community, I think that's a stretch. I think we would know very quickly what's happening. The larger question, and I'd like to kind of redirect a little bit this conversation, because I hear a lot of daydreaming and fantasy in Europe, quite frankly, when it comes to what Europe may look like if the NATO alliance fractures and the Americans, in effect, pull out of Europe. And that's a conversation that I think any serious leader in Europe should have, any military planner should have. And I see, unfortunately, no path forward in Europe, considering the size of those countries, where economic power is located, of creating a replacement, if you will, for what the Americans bring to the table. Of course, you can't say, well, there's no alternative, but if this doesn't work, what do we do? You can try to stitch it. But what I think is likely to happen, and I think this is what Putin has wanted all along, he wanted a sphere of influence deal with the largest European powers. I wrote an article for Orbis, shameless promotion here, in 2022, just as the war was about to start, where I argued that basically Putin was hoping for a Bismarck in reverse. He wanted a deal with Berlin, potentially with Paris, on spheres of influence, Americans out. Remember, they demanding 1997 status quo. So no NATO enlargement, no American troops in Central Europe. And then, in effect, have an agreement that, yes, okay, so these countries are in the European Union, but we will have a say on what energy policy they can pursue, what defense policy they can pursue. That smaller states like Finland, Denmark, Poland, all these countries will have to accept this new spheres of influence deal. And I am convinced he doesn't want to move away from it. And I fear that if you look at the risk level, without the United States deterrent, should it come to that, and I agree with Ben that we're not likely to dismantle the structures of the NATO alliance at this point. Everything will depend on what happens, how the Europeans respond, what they offer, and also what happens to the countries in the new center of gravity of the alliance, which is now the Northeastern Corridor. The entry of Finland and Sweden has completely redefined the dynamic. And that area of the Baltic and the high north and the rest of it is extremely important. And I would submit to you it will be very important for the Trump administration as well. But my point is that nuclear weapons, like any security, ensuring systems that we can put in place, are ultimately the function of the politics of it. What is the structure? What is it that we're trying to build? Who are we trying to protect? And Ben was speaking about the German brigade in the Baltics. Well, that's all nice and good. But from the Russian point of view, an American battalion versus a German brigade, what is a bigger deterrent force? I've argued for quite some time, wrote for the Wall Street Journal about that as well, that we needed a minimum one brigade, US brigade, permanently stationed either in Finland or in one of the Baltic states, 2 in Poland, 1 in Romania, for deterrence to hold. The reason we have legacy military installations in Germany is for that reason. So what I'm missing from this is the determined messaging to the Russian side that, just like in Korea, if you trip the wire, you're going to force the United States into the conflict. So the deterrent element here is very powerful. Conversations in Europe about nuclear weapons and rearmament, in my view, right now, lack that simple geopolitical calculus. They're largely based on how much money can we spend? Can we rebuild our munitions production capabilities? Can we change our acquisition system? Deterrence is not based on how many euros you spend. The last comment, John, if I may, because I think unless the Europeans understand that even though the administration wants to disaggregate the Atlantic and the Pacific theaters, this is part and parcel of the same problem set for the United States. We're a continental island. If you look at the politically incorrect map that we used to have in high schools when our hemisphere is at the center, and just draw the lines around where US deployments are, whether in Europe or in Asia, you understand how important that control is for the US Navy to be able to guarantee access to resources, defend their homeland, project power, and the rest of it. But the Europeans tend to forget the Pacific dimension, and here's the harsh reality of it. Last year, the NDAA put the US military joint force at about 1.3 million. That's about half of what we had during the Cold War on average. And with the recruitment shortfalls we had in every service, we're closer to 1 million. We were spending about 3.1% of our GDP last year on defense. And you factor inflation in weapons acquisitions, because we have the most asinine way of building these extremely sophisticated, precious systems that cost an arm and a leg, and then we can only field them in very limited numbers. So that's about 2.7% in my calculations. That's half of the average we had during the Cold War. We now have 2 theaters. We have a military structure to fight only one major war, one secondary. And so when I talk to my European friends, that when Trump pushes you, or when Biden was pushing you, or Obama was talking about that, this is not because we just want to get a good deal. This is a reality that the American people, after 20 years of the so-called global war on terror, Watson Institute at Brown University estimated the cost of $8 trillion for that. Let's even say this is exaggerated. But we failed to achieve our strategic objectives in those cases, broke a lot of China overall. People are fed up. The bicoastal elites made out like bandits. Our digital aristocracy made billions. Our finance aristocracy made billions. Globalization's gutted the country. Instead of using technology to maintain production, do what the previous generation of American, corporate leaders did, we went for labor arbitrage in China, and we went for cheap Russian energy for the Europeans. and the rest is history. So it's very hard to go to the American people and say we need to double our defense spending, which means, again, I'm looking at Anders, Europe has to do it. You want to save NATO, you have to rebuild the core of conventional capabilities and make sure that SACEUR can tie it all together with our capabilities, and then Russia will not twitch. They'll have no prayer to threaten anybody in Europe. But if this goes in the direction, let's have the European Union create an independent European identity. Let's figure, can the French do this? Can the British do this? The Russians will not be deterred by that. And if you look at their force reconstitution rates, I would argue the Russians within about 3 years will be peaking out and bringing old equipment back. And if the Chinese start a storm in the Indo-Pacific, guess what's going to happen in Europe? You'll be either blackmailed or worse. And so we're kind of on this temporal clock. Europe doesn't have 10 years to rearm. Europe has maybe 3 to 4 years to rearm, in my view, in order to provide that deterrent. I think the situation is much more serious that we're willing to acknowledge. And unfortunately, leadership in the United States and in Europe, by and large, is not articulating those issues to the public. Last comment, I had an argument on a panel with Bridge Colby that was about a year ago. We were the current Undersecretary for Policy. And Bridge's argument was the American people will not accept higher defense spending after these 20 years. And I said, Bridge, has anybody asked? Has anybody made the case? You have the same thing in Europe, because Europe has lived through these fat times for 30 years. Fat times produce managers. They don't produce leaders, unfortunately. So this is the question of leadership. Who's going to come up and start saying this up front?
Okay, well, having said all of that, if I go back to Anders and I say, well, from a European perspective, there's a lot of truth to what Andrew was saying. I mean, but there's a sting in the tail here for the Americans. In many ways, the Americans profited from having been able to sell military equipment to European allies. Not only was it the best that the world could manage, but it was also what the American military industrial complex needed to enrich themselves, if you wanted to be really kind of crass about the whole thing. But Europe has got defense industry, obviously not as interlinked and not as deep as what the American Big Five have, but not that far under it either. I mean, you've got the Swedish Gripen, you've got the Rafale in France, you've got the Eurofighter, and I mean, even in Turkey, they're working on a 6th-generation fighter called the Khan, which is probably nowhere close to the JSF. But from a European perspective, it's a platform that could give some sort of interim 6th-generation capability to European air forces were Brussels to open up negotiations with Ankara, which I can't see happen because there's a world of pain between Ankara and Brussels in terms of attitude and positioning and politics and all the rest of it. So why can't Europe develop its own resources? And if it develops its own resources, it obviously will be inevitable that you're not going to be relying on the United States for much. You can build ships, you can build aircraft carriers, you can build nuclear-powered submarines, you can build ballistic missile launching submarines. It's not that you can't do it, but because everything is hemmed into little nation states and everyone guards the military IP very jealously, it's very difficult to try to broach the borders and create a European force. Maybe I'm wrong, Anders.
No, I think in many ways, when it comes to defense production, then we are in the same boat as the United States, basically, that there are too many things we can't build at scale, and that is a strategic problem when it comes to actual war. So you said, sure, we can build warships, we can build a couple of them, but we don't have the scale to do it, as you know, if there actually is a war to keep up with the pace that the Chinese, for example, can build. But it's the same with the United States. There is the same kind of problem there. I want to say I very much agree with what Andrew said about what can happen if this thing doesn't work and if Europe doesn't take responsibility right now. But I will say I do see many things actually moving here. So, by now, many European countries are spending more on defense than the United States. I believe actually just this year in 2025, Denmark is passing the United States in percent of GDP, which is just crazy for me to say because we've always been lagging behind. So I really do see some movement here. And I very much agree that the problem what can happen if this doesn't work out and NATO splinters is that we're going to end up back in what Europe looked like before the current alliance structures showed up in after the Second World War. We're going to end up in something like before the World War I, where it was all these small nation states that were competing with each other, and that is what we might end up with again. Yeah. So what I see right now is a very, very big concern in Europe that if things don't work out with NATO and with the United States, then there is no plan B. And so I think many of these efforts that we are seeing for Europeans to try to build other structures, it is the plan B, but it's very important because none of us want to end up in that situation where we're just a bunch of small states that have to look out for ourselves. So I think that's the concern. But as you said, there is definitely the potential. I mean, together we do have the muscles, we do have the money, we have the production capabilities to do it if we want to. For many, many years, Europeans have been buying American, but that's because procurement is not just about getting the stuff. It's also about building the alliances and building the long-term relationship. So in Denmark, we've been buying American because we wanted that long-term relationship with the United States, and we saw that as a way to ensure continued American interest in our defense. All that is shifting now. We're seeing very, very quickly a reorientation toward French defense industry, Swedish defense industry, etc. Because there now is a realization that maybe that is what we have to cultivate now.
Anders, can Brussels act as and when I mean Brussels, I mean the EU, act as a grand coordinator, a conductor of the military symphony of Europe to make things harmonize among and between states? I mean, as an Australian looking from my side of the world, looking at Europe, it always bothers me that you have so much potential, and yet from a political bureaucratic perspective, it's the thing that lets Europe down all the time. And no doubt it's a cause of great frustration for people like Andrew, who's sitting in the United States, who also can see the potential, but also sees that the potential isn't being realized. So yes, the European nation states are starting to drive up defense expenditure, but what is needed is that central coordinating body. But once you have that central coordinating body, is that not in itself a threat to NATO? Because you are creating a separate entity or an entity that will sit alongside NATO, which could make NATO, its organization over time, redundant in the European setting, if the European experiment works.
Yeah, I think it comes down to what Andrew said in the beginning, that Europe is not a country. Europe is many countries with different perceptions of threat and different problems that need to be addressed. And we tend to have a very strong focus on the threat from Russia, and that is what many countries in Europe are concerned about. But there are also countries that are more concerned about other issues, such as migration, for example, across the Mediterranean, and who really see that as they see, okay, a war with Russia, that sounds bad, but it's something that potentially could happen, but this is happening right now. So I think it's very important that Europe needs to address more than one issue at a time, and that the Northern and Eastern European countries acknowledge the real concerns of Southern European countries when it comes to other issues, such as migration, for example. I think it is possible to merge this together in some way. It's also possible that we're more going to see coalitions of the willing and things that are more, those countries that want to go ahead will do that. And at least I think it's very important that Europe doesn't get caught up in discussions about burden sharing, and that the Germans won't spend more before the Italians do and those things, because in that case, we won't get anywhere.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So, what do you think, Andrew? Do you think that the Europeans have what it takes to get their stuff together?
Countries get their stuff together when they're under clear and direct threat. For too long, in my view, I guess I'm saying I'm pessimistic. Europe has been on this strategic vacation from history, or strategic kind of holiday, if you will, for 3 post-Cold War decades. And it's very hard right now to realign, readjust, and kind of say, okay, we need to, for instance, go to the citizens and say, we'll need to cut some of the social spending and we need to redirect some of it into defense. Show me a politician in Washington who would love to run there and say, hey, dudes, I'm going to cut your Social Security, but we're doing X, Y, Z. I mean, it's like you're putting a target on yourself. So there's going to be a huge problem there, number one. Number two, I don't see among the largest countries in Europe, maybe with the exception of France, because the French still have this kind of great power, aspirations, and look a little differently. Germany doesn't have a strategic culture that could, contrary to what everybody says, provide leadership that would be needed today. And I'm not saying this to disdain the Germans. I'm just saying this is what I observed for 12 years when I lived and worked in Germany. I actually kind of jokingly said to a German politician at some point who was telling me how Germany would lead, I said, you're not strong, you're fat. Being fat is not the same as being strong. He got offended and made up after that. But there's something to it. There's tremendous wealth in Europe, but there is no strategic culture that factors in the reality that outside of the institutions, there exist national identities, there exist particular interests. To your comment, John, very early on, about the MAGA movement and the Trump phenomenon, the Europeans are in denial, in my view. The consensus among the European elites about what's acceptable in politics and what's not acceptable in politics. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a fan of AfD, I'm not a fan of Front National and the rest of it. But you need to engage with your electorate. You need to create space when people can, when your farmers come in, when I was in Germany when the migration wave was hitting. I can tell you what the Bavarians were telling me privately about this Merkel, wir schaffen das. People have the right to be heard in a democracy, and if you exclude them, brand them far right, brand them populist, backslap, then you destroy what's mother's milk of democratic politics, which is negotiation and compromise. Somewhere in the middle of that we have to meet. And the American elites learned nothing from 2016, I would argue. And the first Trump presidency was treated as a one-off, as an aberration. When Biden became president, everybody was saying, oh, we're back to normal. Well, with the second election and likely 12 years probably going forward, I don't believe that Donald Trump will try for the third term. But what I'm saying is it's likely that somebody from the movement, or maybe somebody from the Trump family, will move in, like the Bushes or the Kennedys. We can have a dynasty of sorts, as we like to call it in our politics, or somebody else like JD or somebody else from the party. I think the European elites need to engage with their publics if they want to have consensus on defense and on spending and on doing things that would require sacrifice. And I frankly don't see it. There is an ideological resistance, I would argue. And the Brussels mindset, I once said to a friend of mine that the European Union is a treaty-based organization that's beginning to masquerade as a nation state, what Anders and I talked about. There is no Europe as a state. And yet this attempt to rewrite the Union Treaty, re-centralize, abolish the veto, qualified majority voting, it's like in the US, you would abolish the Electoral College and only the states of New York and California would make all the decisions. So I think both in the US and in Europe, the real problems are internal. We are wealthy. We have population resources. We have money. The weakness is internal. The weakness is the fracturing of our body politic.
Okay, having said that, do you think, you have to correct me on this one because I don't know exactly the statistics, but there are some countries that practice national service or conscription, right? And I've always thought that those countries, their people are far more likely to understand military necessity because when you go through the system, even as a lowly grunt, you come out of it with an appreciation of the nation that you're meant to be defending in a way that you simply wouldn't if you were just stuck on City Street going to a 9 to 5 job, coming home dog tired at 6 o'clock at night watching the 6 o'clock news and that's it. So should there be more emphasis in the European context, maybe even in the United States, of introducing this national service culture again to get people from all walks of life through the system, even if it's only for 12 months, even if it's only for 18 months, maximum, because it will give people more awareness of what the military is all about for their particular country. I mean, I know
Not only
from
that.
say again?
Yeah, go ahead, sorry. No,
Yeah.
it's not only that. Look, we have a culture, we used to have a culture of citizen soldier in America.
Yeah.
Until Nixon ended the draft to, calm down the campuses during the Vietnam War. In a country as diverse as the US, you need a space where people of every income, every race, every ethnicity meet, sweat together, do something together, discover there's a larger nation out there.
Yes.
Finland has, you serve from 18 to 60, a very small nation of 5.5 million people. The trust in government is off the roof. Everybody serves. Everybody kind of adjusts the specialty. I believe that in across Western cultures, first of all, professional militaries cannot generate the reserves that we need. If you look at what's happening on the Ukrainian front, for example, and kind of extrapolate from that. I wrote once arguing for the return to national service in the US last year. I got so much hate on social media, I couldn't believe it. And then the acting director of selective service reached out to me on LinkedIn, came to my office, we talked about what the issues are. You can live in the United States today and never meet anybody outside of your social milieu, your class, your income level. If you see somebody from outside, it's somebody coming to fix your car or clean your room. That is fundamentally undemocratic. There has to be a return to servant leadership culture where elites govern on behalf of the citizens, not over them. I will apologize, John. I've got to run. So I won't even hear what Anders will say, but I look forward to hearing his comments. Thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor. Anders,
thank you very much.
All the best.
Thank you.
Cheerio.
Thank you.
Wow.
Bye-bye. Bye. All right. Now, Anders, getting back to that, national service in Europe was a thing. It is in parts, but it certainly doesn't go across the boundaries anymore. Do you think that there is enough space in Europe to reconsider national service as the place where, classes meet, different peoples meet, a different ethos of community can be formed within the nation states that are affected by national service?
Many countries have national service already, right? And I don't have the complete map in my head of which countries do and which countries don't, but definitely most of the Nordic, the Eastern European countries already have conscription. And in Denmark, we're just expanding it. It used to be kind of minimalized 4 months thing. Now it's going to be 11 months. We're just introducing also female conscription. This is definitely something that more and more countries are adopting in Europe. And it's also a part of the realization of the situation that there is right now, and that this is required, and this is the kind of capability we will need going forward, that we need to build a mobilization force. We need to have this reserve of people that we can call upon if it's necessary.
See, I think, Australia in particular needs to have this discussion more openly. There are a few people like myself that like to whisper it out into my community, but just like Andrew, I think that there are many more people who just like to preserve the system as it is, even though the system has systemic problems. And Australia spends what, $55.7 billion in the last financial year on defense. And yet, for that return on investment, the Australian taxpayer has just seen the People's Liberation Army Navy sail right around Australia, conduct live fire exercises in the Tasman Sea, with which it wasn't the Air Force or the Royal Australian Navy that got out and intercepted those Chinese warships or caught them red-handed doing their thing. It was a Virgin Australia flight to New Zealand that saw it and then had to report it to the New Zealand authorities, who then had to report it to Australia. Now, as a taxpayer, I think that there's something wrong with this picture. And I do think that there is a very strong case for Australia to seriously contemplate some form of national service. But we need to sort of put down a plan that people can understand, a plan that doesn't freak people out. It doesn't, national service doesn't have to be all military. It can be tree planting, it can be, environmental if you happen to be that way inclined, and you don't have to run a fascist dictatorship sort of model to get this thing done. But it is vitally important when the world looks like it's losing its way in a very significant a very significant way, that if we don't get our defenses in order, we're going to end up having some major problems. But speaking of your country in particular, what I'm curious about, Anders, is as a Dane, how was Trump's tilt at Greenland seen? I mean, was there an upwelling of national sentiment? I mean, here in Australia, we didn't hear that much, which is kind of odd because, a Tasmanian has married into your royal family. So I would have expected that we'd have more of a sort of insight into things Danish, but we don't. So what can you say about that particular episode, and what will it mean for the territorial integrity of American allies moving forward, but also of the territorial integrity of NATO? Because, of course, it's not just Denmark, it's Canada, another NATO member that's under the Anschluss diktats of Trump.
Yeah, I think the important thing to know is that Greenland is not really Denmark. It's a different country. So we are together in a kind of commonwealth, right? There is this we share the same monarch, but the general feeling in Denmark is not that Greenland is ours. Greenland is the country of the Greenlanders, and there has been a long discussion about them wanting independence and that they might want to move in that direction. There's really no urge in Greenland to become part of the United States. What they are talking about is being an independent country. So it's a very different thing. But I think definitely there is the feeling that Denmark has the responsibility for this situation. We have it is our military responsibility to also cover Denmark. So I'm in the Danish armed forces. Part of my responsibility is to also be the Greenlandic armed forces, and so we have to do our best to serve their interests in whatever they decide to do. But it's absolutely unacceptable that the United States comes and say that they're going to just annex this and insinuate they might do it against the will of the Greenlanders. That's absolutely not acceptable, because they are, in that sense, a part of our country. There is definitely concern here. I think there is the realization now that this is not a joke. It's not something that Trump says because he just wants to create a bit of trouble or, get some attention. Like, he is serious. He wants this. And there is concern about how he might go ahead with this, and what he might do. And, what kind of pressure he might try to put on Denmark, on Greenland, economic pressure, even military pressure, right? And that is obviously one of those things that also creates this feeling that how could we really trust on the United States to be our security guarantee in Europe when they at the same time behave like that and demand to take a part of our territory and annex this country that is definitely not theirs and don't want to be annexed.
So do you think, with the two impending threats that Europe currently has, the Russians on the one side, uncontrolled migration from the Middle East and Africa, there is a third threat, and that threat is the Trump administration?
Yeah, I definitely. That is the big concern. I think there are two basically several pressures on Europe. So one of them is the increased threat from Russia, and if that had been the only thing, then that would be manageable. But the problem is the security guarantee is disappearing at the same time, and there is very strong concern about where Trump is going with this, and what is he trying to achieve? Is this actually an attempt at taking over power in the United States as a kind of puppet democracy where he gets to rule? It's not all that different from the playbooks we've seen other places, and also the fact that they seem eager to export this MAGA ideology also to Europe. So
Well,
Andrew
we've got it
talked.
here. We've got it here.
Yeah.
We're heading to a federal election, and one of the minor parties decided to dip their toe well into the bucket by calling themselves Trumpet of Patriots. Trumpet of Patriots, a play on the Trump word. It is gobsmacking that this thing is actually popular among Australians who are jaded by the political system for very similar reasons to why the Americans turned against the swamp back in the day. So, yeah, look, there are legitimate concerns, and I understand what Andrew was saying, and I think that he's right. And really, to understand and unpack Trump, you've got to go into the weeds of American politics and how people felt betrayed. But at the same time, this alternative is not going to serve people well, because if it is indeed, as you say, out of the playbook of other autocrats, what autocrats tend to do with their initial supporters is throw them under a bus. They're one of the first victims. With Hitler, it was the SA, the brown shirts that went under the bus. With MAGA, well, maybe those Rust Belt state people who are currently wearing the hat and running around and praising Elon Musk are going to be the next under the bus. So it is a scary kind of prospect, and it's extraordinarily unstable. And it's strange, even hearing Andrew, it doesn't comfort me to know that we don't seem to really have much of a grasp on what's going on. And I don't think that the powers that be in Washington know either. And that is a worry, because it's not just the lack of trust, it's just the lack of stability. Yep, interesting times. Anyway, Anders, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to have you back at some point. And as I said, it'd be great to have another panel with you, Ben, and Andrew, and even just going solo on something, yeah?
Absolutely, anytime.
Okay, thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Andrew Michta, Ben Hodges, and Anders Puck Nielsen, our very first panel discussion. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about our esteemed guests and connect with them on social media. Now, on to questions for the audience. Is Europe repeating the mistakes of the past? Can the continent defend itself without America? And what should NATO do if Trump pressures Ukraine into a surrender? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Auscast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. If you have comments or questions about the podcast, post them in the comments section, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producer of The Focus, Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor, and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.